Thank you, and thanks to Dominique for the invitation to speak here and to participate in the seminar, and thanks to all of you for sticking it out until the last presentation. Dominique asked me to speak about this relatively specific topic. In fact, there was the question posed to me that he gave to the title of the paper that I ended up writing. And, you know, I started out with a sort of a problem because both political realities, principles, and, you know, even conscience would demand at this point that Ukraine make no agreements with Russia. After the annexation of Crimea, the incitement followed by direct intervention in the east, it would be unseemly at best and perhaps treasonous at worst for Kiev to engage in any sort of deal-making with Moscow today. And one is often told that, both in the corridors of power in Ukraine and in Washington, which is where I come from. But an unsentimental assessment of the facts suggests to me, at least, that a political settlement between Russia and Ukraine is not only desirable, but perhaps more importantly, necessary for Ukraine's continued survival. Such a settlement, in my view, would be more important in the short to medium term than Western support, either the support described in official rhetoric, let alone the far more modest reality. And while the EU association agreement will be critical for the long-run prospects for structural reform in Ukraine, the lack of a settlement with Russia could easily render it irrelevant. And this sort of relates to a broader phenomenon that the fact that Russia's acquiescence to, if not outright support for, the association agreement and Ukraine's broader European aspirations would be necessary for their success, that fact, I think, has always been too politically uncomfortable to acknowledge. But whether we like it or not, the fact that Ukraine's economy is highly dependent on Russia in a variety of ways that the West cannot afford to undo is one that we have to confront in this context. And in the paper, I get into the details of that dependency, and it's multifaceted. It goes way beyond gas. And the key here, I think, is that it's not the power necessarily to control Ukraine's economy, but to undermine and spoil potential plans that Russia doesn't like. And now, with approximately half of the Donbass under control of Russia-backed insurgents, Moscow has additional leverage. We've heard some talk at this conference, and certainly you hear talk in the Ukrainian media, that Kiev should resign itself to the loss of the Donbass. In the paper, I get into some details about why I think that losing the Donbass economically is just not a viable option. And of course, regaining full control of it will only come through an agreement with Russia. So the ugly truth, I think, whether we like it or not, is that Russia, having annexed one part of Ukraine and stoked a conflict in another, can still undermine any plan for Ukraine's future if it so chooses. Before this year, I think there was a case for downplaying the practical implications of that truth. We could not be sure how willing Russia would be to accept the costs that come with exercising coercive leverage to achieve its goals in Ukraine. But today, there should no longer be any doubt. Policies based on an assumption that Moscow will simply accept or accommodate outcomes in Ukraine, regardless of the perceived implications for its interests, are doomed to fail. And moreover, and I think more importantly, such policies subject Ukrainians to known risks, both to their lives and livelihoods, making the policies somewhat akin to negligence, if not malpractice. So if a lasting political settlement, I think, is clearly necessary. But what would it take to get one? We're pretty far away from that today. So in the absence of a hegemon like we had in Bosnia, prepared to impose a settlement from the outside, some factors that you'd look for to get an agreement to end a conflict like this include some overlap in the parties' positions and their goals, allowing for a potential negotiated outcome that all sides can claim as a victory, a degree of flexibility in negotiating positions, an overriding shared interest in getting a deal, and domestic support for compromise. And I think what makes this current crisis so disturbing is that most, if not all, these factors are utterly absent. So I want to talk a little bit about the parties' goals. There's been a lot of speculation, of course, about Russia's goals in this conflict, which is somewhat surprising to me. If you look on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs website on March 17th, a document that was presented to the U.S. Secretary of State 2 days earlier, they lay it all out there, and I get into some of the details in the paper, but to summarize, I think their goals are pretty clear. A neutral Ukraine, non-exclusive geo-economic arrangements, and decentralization of authority from Kiev to the regions, whether we like it or not. I think those are the goals that we've seen repeatedly over the last several months. What about Ukrainian and Western goals? Nominally, of course, the shared strategic goal for Ukraine between the US, the EU, and the current government is both straightforward and breathtakingly ambitious, to create a Western-oriented and integrated, prosperous, territorial integral, secure, and democratic Ukraine. In order to achieve this goal, the West, in addition to sanctioning Russia, has doubled down on support for the new government, both political, diplomatic, and financial, pushing structural reforms to modernize Ukraine's perpetually underperforming and largely unreformed economy, and have accelerated integration with Euro-Atlantic institutions, including the EU, as we've heard, and NATO as well. On the face of it, if you look at those two sets of goals, it's a pretty bleak picture. I think the only thing you could say that they have in common is that achieving one set of the goals necessarily entails undermining the others. And I think that fundamental incompatibility has been masked by the series of deals, mini deals, struck in recent weeks. But in the paper, I argue that rather than a substantive compromise, these agreements merely postpone final resolution, kicking the can down the road, to use an American term often that somewhat remind me of the politics surrounding the U.S. budget and our budget deficit. But as we've discovered in the United States in recent years, that political compromise doesn't become easier with time. So just to say a few words about the agreements that were passed, the two Minsk agreements, the September 5th memorandum and the September 19th protocol, have demonstrably failed to create a sustainable equilibrium on the ground. And then there's also this agreement to postpone implementation of the Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Agreement until January 1st, 2016, due to the Russian threat to implement retaliatory trade measures against Ukraine if its concerns about the agreement were not addressed. But the agreement itself, of course, the association agreement, which incorporates the DCFTA, has been ratified by the European Parliament, the Ukrainian Parliament, and several EU member state parliaments. In other words, compromise on the substance of the document is arguably now even more remote of a possibility than it was before. And meanwhile, both leaders in Moscow and Kiev, I think, are preparing their publics for confrontation, not compromise. But if we take a step back and imagine a negotiation between Putin and Poroshenko conducted in a political vacuum, without the path dependency of the association agreement process, the war, Crimea annexation, et cetera. I know this is sort of a fantastical scenario. Nonetheless, it's not inconceivable that they could reach a deal. I think the contours of such a compromise would likely include reaffirmation of the reality of Ukraine's non-alignment, mutually satisfactory trade arrangements among Russia, Ukraine, and the EU, implementation of a decentralization plan somewhat more ambitious than Poroshenko's June proposals, but perhaps significantly less far-reaching than Russia's March proposals, a return of full Ukrainian control over its border with Russia, perhaps with an international peacekeeping force on the ground on Donbass, and so on and so forth. But the problem, I think, is that the events of the past year, and particularly Russia's brazen actions in Ukraine, make that scenario seem more like a fairy tale than a historical counterfactual. And the problem for Ukraine and its Western partners is that the Kremlin doesn't need a deal to achieve its baseline objectives in this conflict. It could do so by bringing Ukraine to its knees economically or by continuing to sow instability in the East, which effectively, of course, makes it impossible for the government in Kiev to pursue what is Putin's nightmare scenario of a Ukraine in EU and NATO. I think Moscow would prefer a negotiated settlement over those scenarios, if only because it would be less costly, but it does not need one. The same, however, cannot be said for Ukraine. Notwithstanding sometimes the triumphalist rhetoric that you hear coming from Kiev, Ukraine clearly needs a deal. But for Western policymakers, I think it's this factor, namely that Russia has a strong bargaining position relative both to Ukraine and the West, that ultimately makes this crisis so different from others in the post-Cold War period. Never before have they faced a major military and nuclear power as an adversary in a regional dispute occurring in that power's backyard. In Kosovo, Russia was an opponent, but Kosovo barely registers on the hierarchy of Russian national security imperatives, whereas Ukraine, by contrast, I think ranks just short of national survival. And eastern Ukraine, of course, is one of the few places beyond Russia's borders in which Moscow can deliver the assets required to sustain an insurgency. And even if it were to receive the much ballyhooed lethal military assistance from the West, and even that doesn't seem likely, Ukraine cannot defeat such an insurgency if Russia remains determined from preventing it from doing so. So talking to Moscow and negotiating is a policy of necessity. It's not one that any Ukrainian or Western leader would want to embrace publicly. But for Ukraine to survive this crisis, they might not have a choice. Thank you.